Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And my distinguished guests today are Zbigniew Pisarski, the head of Pułaski Foundation based in Warsaw, Poland. Hi, Zbigniew.
Hi, hello, Jacek.
And Nicholas Myers, War and Peace, and also Senior Fellow at Strategy and Future. The guest you well know. We did always discuss the Eastern flank, but today, a special event. Today we will be discussing the how to say that, Nick, the place that the Polish foreign affairs are having in the real interactions that will be shown during the presentations within the last 2 years. How should we define today's event, Nick? Your floor.
So the title I've come up with is Poland in Great Power Competition, and to be clear, I have arbitrarily picked the United States, Russia, and China as the world's great powers. I don't really have an explanation for why, but it seems to be the popular way to call them now.
Before we start the presentation, I want to draw everybody's attention to the fact that Nick Myers has come up with a mechanism of really assessing interactions, assessing different thresholds of seriousness and impact of interactions that really show the interests of great powers and the attention that Poland draws in the great power competition that is already happening all across Eurasia and around this supercontinent. So let's get started, Nick.
So I will put my slide onto the screen for everybody to enjoy or despise. So yes, Poland in great power competition. And I'm specifically focusing on the last 2 years because those are the 2 years in which I've completely finalized the methodology and have all of the data already. So I could do this for any country around the world or any region around the world. But we're going to look at Poland today for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's of great interest, obviously, to both Strategy and Future and the Pułaski Foundation, but also it's an excellent case study in how the coronavirus pandemic over the past year has affected the dynamics of US, Russia, and Chinese competition around the world, with the benefit of a specific place to compare. So to explain the data that I'm using here, I'm going through almost exclusively government websites and propaganda. So there's 27,000 data points about each time the government has reference of Russia, China, and the United States has referenced any other country around the world. And I just shoved it into a giant Excel database and put a whole bunch of formulas in order to count up how everything functions. The disadvantage of this approach is that it doesn't really take into account the economic side of things. And I find that if I were trying to find elementary statistics to compare the three countries, none of them are especially good at doing a head-to-head comparison with FDI advantages the United States and trade turnover advantages China. But this is still an interesting comparison of how the governments perceive each other and how their militaries are planning according to the threats that each government also feels about the broader world. And lastly, I'm using central government information, not embassy data, which means that there's less of a centrality to where the diplomats are acting. You get to see only what's being discussed in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. So to a certain extent, Poland is sort of a passive actor in the background here, which is something we should discuss at the end, to what extent the Warsaw debate does or does not conform to what I'm about to go over. So the first thing I want to go over is the amount of interest in Poland. This is the simplest statistic I've got here, and it is just how many times Poland comes up in an individual mention of an issue in the United States, Russia, and China today. And for the past 2 years, here we have it. 75 times in 2019 for US, down to 54 in 2020. For the Russians, it didn't change very much, 29 to 28. And for China, 16, falling down to 9. Now, that sounds like some wonderful numbers that are difficult to compare if you have no basis for where these fall into the broader world. So I'll give you, in turn, some contextualizing statistics. These show the percentage of that number for out of all US, Russian, and Chinese interactions with the rest of the world. and then their percentage interactions among the EU 27 members. So this excludes the United Kingdom even in 2019. What I would say here is that if all countries in the world were weighted the same, though Germany was weighted the same as Sao Tome and Principe, for instance, then we should expect that the world percentage would be 0.5%, as it is in Russia and China in 2019. If among the EU countries, it would be 3.7%, which is, again, pretty close to where Russia ends up being. So you'll see here that these numbers show that Poland has more influence than an ordinary country in the United States, and about what you would expect in Russia. And then in terms of its rating among the world, Poland ranks actually pretty highly in the United States in terms of places that are of interest. It's up there with the Saudis and other major countries, including it in 2019. It was the third most important country in the EU simply by frequency of measurement. Of course, behind France and Germany, but still, number 3 is perhaps a bit higher than you would expect to begin with. Whereas for Russia, it's a bit lower down, and in China, it's solidly in the middle. Incidentally, these drop in numbers is going to be pretty consistent across most transitions from 2019 to 2020. Overall, coronavirus reduced diplomatic interactions by that 9%, I found, for the entire world. So it's about on average here. But let's break that down. What are the individual institutions from each of these countries that are interacting with Poland? So I break these into 5 different groups. There's the leader, that's Trump, Xi Jinping, and Vladimir Putin themselves. The other executives within the government or bureaucrats, the professional diplomats, the ministries of foreign relations or the State Department, military and MODs, and everything else, which includes legal people and paramilitary, so things like the Coast Guard and things of that nature. So in the United States, in 2019 and 2020, we see that not an overwhelming, but a majority of interactions with Poland were via the military. It doesn't sound especially surprising because the United States is said to have an extremely militarized foreign policy in the Trump administration. But if we compare this to the entire world within the United States, the US policy towards the world tends to only have about 1/3 of its interactions coming from the military, and the State Department still has a plurality of the interactions. So we see that Poland does not figure especially highly in terms of the United States diplomatic strategy, but it has an outsized place within its military one. If we change this approach to the Russians, it's a bit more interesting. We're seeing now that the MID, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has a clear majority of all interactions with Poland. This is not especially surprising because the Russian MID is the powerhouse of Russian information warfare. So for an antagonistic state, you'd expect it to be a pretty high percentage. This relatively high 35% other in 2019 is not what I think anybody was expecting, including me. There was a large number of extradition agreements between Russia and Poland in 2019, in particular for Ukrainian citizens being shuffled back and forth. So why, I'm not entirely sure what was going on that year. But again, if we compare this to Russia worldwide, we see that it's not horrendously out of disproportionate for how much the MID is interacting here, but there is relatively limited other forms of interaction. For China, it's again much more Ministry of Foreign Relations based. But obviously, when you get down to only 9 interactions, the percentages can get a bit shifty for a time. So those 2 Xi Jinping moments interacting with Poland is that Xi had a call with President Duda in, I believe, April, and then also sent him a personalized message for get well soon from coronavirus when he caught it later in the year, which brought him all the way up to 22%, perhaps not quite worth it. But again, if we compare this worldwide, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China has a disproportionate lock on what's going on. Otherwise, not not terribly disproportionate, but it's difficult to measure in 2020 with only 9 interactions. If we look at this in terms of taking those numbers and breaking them into 2 groups, favorable and unfavorable, we can start to see to what extent the Polish interactions with the United States, Russia, and Poland are positive or negative. So talking favorability, we're talking about straightforward interactions or meetings, statements of support or counter-terrorist solidarity, agreements, and then on disfavor, we got condemnations of behavior, punishments, and military or other provocations. And it's not terribly surprising what comes out of it. For the United States, especially in the Trump administration, it's been all positive for the past 2 years. I have not found a single negative thing that they've done about Poland the entire time. Some congressional Democrats had bad things to say about Poland, but those are not in the Trump administration, obviously. For China, that one negative thing from 2019 is actually reference to the Huawei executive arrested in Poland to saying he'd better release him, which is it could have been a lot worse, I think is the best way to put it. You can ask the Australians about that. And then again, for Russia, if anything, that 41% positive in 2019 seems a bit high to me. But again, that's because there's so many extradition agreements that are going through that particular year. 2020, that's a bit closer to normal, the 89% negative. 11% positive, I think, is just some consultations with the ambassador in Moscow. So next, how do we integrate those favor and disfavor to figure out the degree to which the relations are positive or negative? The numbers I have here can amalgamate all of those things so that we're waiting not only that phone calls among leaders are more important than just phone calls among diplomats, but military exercises are important, as well as deployment of forces to Poland and others. It comes up with a way of systematizing what is or isn't important, in addition to which a statement saying, release that Huawei executive if you know what's good for you, versus Russia really, really doesn't like this, are weighted somewhat differently. And we get this spread here, that the US relationship with Poland is a very, very high number. The Russian relationship with Poland is low and getting worse. And the Chinese relationship was okay and is now just sort of cooled off simply because there were fewer interactions over the course of 2020. Again, this general decline in the numbers from 2019 to 2020 should not be especially confusing or specific to Poland. This happened pretty much everywhere around the world. If you can't have meetings, but you can do diplomatic statements, that means that you tend to exaggerate the number of negative things. So even the fact that Russia felt worse about Poland in 2020 is broadly consistent with coronavirus's impact on world diplomacy. But again, if we compare this to the EU 27, we'll see here that US perception of Poland was actually the best of all countries within the EU in 2019. To a certain extent, this had to do with the fact that Trump could not get along with Merkel or Macron, and so it certainly held them down. In 2020, it fell to number 2 behind France. This is because Macron stopped talking about Trump, so Trump stopped talking about him, and the just frequency of French-US military interactions in Africa and the Middle East brought it up to number 1. In China and Russia, it remained broadly consistent between the 2 years. But again, for China, Poland appears to be punching probably about where you'd expect its weight if you lined up all of the countries of Europe according to its GDP size. For Russia, it's near the back because obviously Poland, along with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are the real problem children it has in the European Union. And so I believe it is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that fill out the remaining countries underneath of Poland. But again, just looking at this, showing the magnitude of the quality of the relationship, showing that the United States actually has a pretty good relationship with Poland, whereas Russia obviously doesn't, does not show the importance which those 3 capitals attach to Warsaw's. For that, I have a different measurement. So how I how I look at how the three capitals perceive the importance of the opinion is by measuring the number of diplomatic bureaus that are interacting with the Polish diplomats. This seems like an extremely arcane way of doing it, but my point is a good example. In Russia, there is a deputy foreign minister who's responsible for the Middle East and Africa. His name is Mikhail Bogdanov, and he has meetings with lots and lots of people, and most of them are with Middle Easterners. But he will also meet with the French or the German Middle East people in order to understand what French and German Middle East policy is. He does not meet with the Hungarian or the Serbian Middle East people because he doesn't care, even though Russian relations with Hungary and Serbia are much better than they are with France and Germany. So this ends up being a pretty useful stand-in for just how much importance does the capital actually assess Warsaw's foreign policy as having. So we'll bring up the numbers here. For Poland, it is not good. I break it into three different categories of high, medium, and low. The numbers are slightly different for each one because the United States simply has more of these deputy assistant secretary of state level positions. Russia has a middle amount and China only has 6. So for each of them, I think 2 is the limit for what low is, and then 3 to 5 is medium, or 4 to 6 is medium for the United States, and so on. But if we're looking at this combination of things, these are all interesting statistics in and of themselves by themselves, but I can integrate them into one table to come up with a characterization for the Polish relationship with these. And this is what I've come up with on a completely theoretical basis. We take that one I just had of high, medium, or low, and we put that as an altitude on the left, and then we take that quality score and relate it to what that original interest is. If it's greater than the interest, it goes in the left column. If it's between 0 and the interest score itself, in the middle. And if it's a negative number, it goes on the right. Poland ends up here. The Russians perceive Poland as an adversary. The Chinese perceive it merely as a peripheral place. And the United States did think of Poland as a partner in 2019, but under the exigencies of coronavirus, it has been demoted to just part of the sphere of influence in 2020. This may change over time, but this is where we are now. Now, I'll point out here that some people might be freaking out saying, oh, allies in the top left, isn't Poland an ally of the United States? They are treaty allies. Poland and the United States are both NATO members. I'm not discounting that. The point is, when I use this term for ally, I'm referring to a speech that Putin gave in 2014, that an ally reduces your own sovereignty because you must take his positions into account whenever you make your own decisions. And Poland does not have that weight in US foreign policy. Perhaps unsurprising, perhaps not. The last point about...
Nick, if I may, that was a very interesting and critical element of your presentation. If we could get deeper so that the audience could understand. Because alliances are creating also the constraints and risks. So this is the alliance, what the alliance is all about. This is why correct me if I understand it, not in line with your presentation. So alliances are always the two-way streets. Of course, partners are not equal, but still it's a partnership, even if of unequal shares. And that means that within alliance, you need to account, you need to consider what your ally is thinking in order for the alliance to be a cohesive thing. Did your interaction chart suggest that one should drop down into the sphere of influence kind of relationship? So the main ally that is holding this alliance together doesn't care anymore about your sort of interest because it doesn't have to, or it doesn't show the need to take care about the interest?
It's not necessarily that, but it does imply that it's possible. So for example, the US as the best, as the highest of those relations with the United Kingdom in 2020. Again, not a particular surprise. So it would go into the ally category. That doesn't mean that the United States won't do something because the United Kingdom objects, but it does mean it will cause a lot more concern than if it is in the sphere of influence. So I'd say I render it as it's distinctly more possible that if Poland didn't like something that the United States was doing, there would be very little difficulty in Washington ignoring it relative to if it were the United Kingdom, for example.
So there is something about gravity in it because it happens automatically. You need to carry some weight in order to be reckoned with. So, yes, so I mean, the perception of your impact, corresponds with the level of activity to service the relationship, so to speak.
Correct. Because I would point out the quality of the US-UK relationship using just using that quality score I was showing earlier where Poland scored 108. The UK is not significantly higher than Poland on that. The UK-US relationship is about as good as the Polish-US relationship. It's slightly better, but not much. The point here is Poland doesn't have as much importance to sway US opinion. So I'll finish out my points on diplomacy here by just showing the frequency of the statements that the countries were making about Poland and whether they were positive or negative. Again, not especially surprising here. For Russia, they were all negative. For the United States, they were all positive. And for China, it was somewhere in between. I'll just point that out as an interesting factor. I don't think there's too much more to be said here. I'll switch now, as we finish this up, to the military side. If we map out all of the US military exercises in Poland, this map's going to populate very fast. They come out here. And I'll let you play with this slide as much as you want on your own spare time, but I want to point out a couple of things that are interesting about this distribution. There's 9 exercises in Poland, 2 in the Baltic Sea, and 2 that occurred elsewhere in the world. One over the Black Sea and one among a Polish contingent in Kuwait, exercised in the United States. I find it interesting that they're all concentrated on the northern and western sides of the country. Nothing really between Warsaw or on any of the major axes, except to a certain one, the one in Jaglowa, Bull Run 12, you see over the side. In addition to which, like the biggest one, Allied Spirit, is way off in the northwest. I just find that particularly interesting, but we can talk about this in greater detail if you'll want. But of course, what is the threat environment they're acting within? For that, I map out the Russian exercises that take place directly on the Polish border. In this map, the first number is just the number of training activities of all varieties reported by the Russian MOD. The second number in parentheses, those are just the Uchenia, the highest form of military exercise. And you see that they're going on all over the place in Kaliningrad, but only 4 activities in Belarus. And both of those only factor into 2 exercises. So if we summarize them by region, we see that this is only using Uchenia for the Russian side. They have 57 exercises in Kaliningrad, 2 across Belarus, and then a couple distributed across the north and west of Poland. If we simplify even further, we say Poland, there was 11, in Belarus, Russia had 2, and in Kaliningrad, there was 75. This is not the exhaustive list of Russian, Belarusian exercises. These are just the only 2 exercises that happened inside of Belarus in 2020. But if I extract which were the largest of them, the US one was the biggest by a pretty substantial margin, though I would point out that Slavyanskaya Bratstva had 2 BTGs brought in at the last minute because the Russians decided to make it into a big demonstration at the high point of Lukashenko having difficulty. So we don't know what number it capped out at, but we'd say it went up possibly as high as 2,000 more. So we see that there's 75 exercises happening in Kaliningrad. You might think that's a lot of exercises. Russian exercises tend to be smaller and more modular than US ones. US ones tend to be pretty big and comprehensive. And also Kaliningrad actually is Russian territory, whereas Poland is pretty far from the United States. So to a certain extent, there's balance here. Last thing I will show for a data-driven thing is if we take that the perception score and we map it out month by month, we can see that it's progressively getting worse for Russia, and for the United States, it's on the decline. But we can also overlay all of the events that occurred in 2020 and see just how they interact with the overall perception of Poland going on over the course of the year. Now, you might be thinking, why is the US score falling when Allied Spirit, Baltops, and Bull Run are all happening at the same time? That's because there were a lot more exercises in 2019 when there weren't coronavirus restrictions. So this is a 12-month rolling average. So those are just being factored out over time. But we see that it's basically been stable and that the summertime was when most of the activity occurred, as is typical in a military-dominated relationship. So what conclusions I would have before we turn it over just to a conversation now? COVID-19 has marginally reduced Poland's perceived importance as a battleground of great power competition. To a certain extent, this does not impact the Russian perception, but it's not a dramatic difference. Second, US foreign policy toward Poland is disproportionately military in nature. Third, this one I don't think is much of a surprise. The US perceives Poland as aligned with its interests, whereas Russia perceives it as an adversary. And lastly, the Chinese interest in Poland, at least for the past 2 years, has been limited. And I know we can talk a bit more about how that wasn't always the case, but I think those are the most important conclusions we have from the data here. So with that, I will end sharing the screen and we can transfer this to a conversation. I'm happy to bring up the data if you need to do it about it again, but I'd love to turn this now to a conversation more about what do we think Warsaw should be doing in the context that has been established by this data.
Zbig, do you want to comment?
Yes, thank you, Jacek, once again for invitation, and Nick for this really elaborate presentation. And I admire your bravery in trying to do something what is really challenging, because quantifying foreign policy and international security, and particularly from the perspective of realpolitik, it's really difficult task, and but I think it's really needed, because actually what you presented is quite interesting from the Polish-American relations. This I would have to use this word a bit. This kind of degradation in perception of the Polish importance in the eyes of Washington. This is something what should make a wake-up call in Warsaw, because what you presented in 2019 as a partnership relation and 2020 as something what potentially could be perceived that Poland is a partner, but the partner that you don't have to ask for opinion. And that's something really disturbing, and it doesn't make me happy at all. And I think we all should understand that you don't respect a partner that is always saying yes, and because the partner, it looks like, is disrespecting himself. And I think that this is a large mistake that the Polish foreign policy community is doing in relations with the United States, that we are quite openly just complementing American policy, not underlying Polish importance in American policy in the region, because it is from different angle than negotiation about our role. And actually, what you presented in one of the last diagrams, that I don't know if you, Jacek, have seen it, but each time we made a purchase, the perception of Poland was going down. With F-35, with javelins, so the tendency was after that negative. So if you see, F-35 deal approved, then we go down. Javelin, we go down. I don't know if it's a direct correlation or coincidence, but it looks that we are buying this let's say it's kind of insurance, but it doesn't make us more important. And in the relations, so importance of Poland in the eyes of our American friends is going down after this. So generally, as we had a discussion before our meeting, I think this kind of quantifying foreign policy, great power perception of Poland and other countries, this is something what is needed, because this is measurable, this is quantifiable methodology that puts some perspective, objectivization of these processes. Because it's very easy to say what we quite often hear from White House. What I'm doing is great, everything is great, but well, we could discuss about it. So we can discuss when we have some numbers. We can discuss when we have some measurable data. And I see that Unique did a huge effort to quantify a number of factors that are describing the power of the country and give us a real image, not just a wishful thinking how important we are because we have some nice, polite words from this or other capital. And we can go in details about the differences between the US, Russia, and China, but I will get back to Jacek, because I'm pretty sure that he has also his remarks about general idea of quantifying perception of the power of the country and importance in relation with our key powers that are neighboring us or in the world. Thank you.
Yeah, Nick, but of course, I would not surprise anybody by saying that it's it's great, and I hope that the mechanism that you possess within your inventory, let me put it that way, is capable of assessing the same vectors of foreign policy, Poland vis-a-vis Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, Germany vis-a-vis Poland, and so on, so forth. That would be very interesting, and not only Poland but other countries as well. I think it helps understand things that has merely been positioned on intuition, and now it is reinforced by real data. I understand that they were presented in an abridged form for the sake of presentation and clarity and the saving of time. Let me put it that way. I think it was Otto von Bismarck that used to say that foreign policy, and actually politics as well, is all about the maneuvering space, maneuvering room. So it's a very dynamic state of affairs in nature, to be in correlation in relation to someone else, especially to another great power. Once you are deprived of the maneuvering space, maneuvering room, because your policy has become a policy of the client state, and especially in this military domain, then not only do you not need to be reckoned with, but also your options are limited. I think, and that we have been advocating that at Strategy and Future over a long time, that the doctrine of Giedroyć and Miroszewski of our Eastern policy, for foreign policy, has been completely warped. And this is not what Giedroyć was saying. And his last words in the book that he wrote was that Poland should play its own role in the East. And only then will it be important for the West. So we can never deprive ourselves of the maneuvering room in our Eastern buffer zone. And I think that the presentation that you showed is a complete devastation of this. Also, Giedroyć added that we cannot just simply run the US foreign policy in the East, because nobody will reckon with us. Exactly, this is what he stated, literally. And I sent all the listeners to read the Autobiografia na cztery ręce, the final chapter, the last word, it's called, and he was the anchor of Polish grand strategy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, his ideas. So, how come did we arrive at this point? What happened? That's a key question, and especially in great power competition, when alliances will be dynamic, and the importance of each country will be of high importance in the balancing game that has started across Eurasia. This will be a critically important thing. Plus, one more thing, if I may add. So much talk was made about 3 Cs initiative as a major geopolitical action of the United States promoting Poland. And your presentation actually doesn't show anything out of this concept. It's all about military and the US foreign policy that is heavily bent on the forward presence in Eurasia and using the leverage of power based on the US power projection across Eurasia. As simple as that. So 3 Cs is an empty shell. What is your opinion about that? How do you have any, we haven't raised this issue, but 3 Cs was like a, highly discussed subject, and it turns out to be empty. Can you comment on that, Nick?
So I can't comment in too much detail for a very simple reason. The 3 Cs initiative is a frequent talking point in US State Department press releases, but they release almost no information about what 3 Cs does. And I do need to emphasize here that the limiting factor to the data I have is I can only record what they want to say. So if there is a big secret iceberg inside the 3 Cs initiative that they're not publishing, then maybe it is a huge deal that it's just classified. But in the open source details, it has had virtually no effect, if only because they won't say anything important coming out of it.
Yes. And I hope that our listeners will take a due note of that in this pivotal moment when the future of Europe is being redesigned. Zbig, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think that in case of projects like 3C, the initiative, which is, in my opinion, important, but not unfortunately delivered, and this is actually what could get some meaningfulness only with, or not only, but definitely with real financial commitment from US government. And the numbers which we are talking about, American contribution, we are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, which is nothing incomparable with $1 billion from EU in development of infrastructural projects inside of the EU. So if this project should get any significance as a tool both for Poland, for the Central Europe, or for the United States, without real financial commitment, it has no meaning. And so that's in my opinion the most important, lack of financial commitment. So this is just a political figure, but still, from the Polish perspective, it is important. It would be useful, and it's a pity that it's not happening this way. In comparison with the Chinese projects around Europe, if you take a look at the number of Chinese money inflowing into the European Union, let's say infrastructure of ports, harbors, ferries, communication hubs, this is the place where the real money are inflowing into the European Union area, and it will be a leverage for Chinese trade policy towards EU. And it's a matter of time when it will get its real significance. So right now, just a brief example, I'm right now sitting in city of Łódź, which just a few days ago declared that its city airport is for sale. And among the first invited investors, they declared India and China, that we are inviting investors from this region. Maybe you want to buy a communication hub for your trade needs. And probably I would guess that they already know some investors that are interested from these countries that might consider investment in purchasing this airport. So there is a strategic communication and strategic actions. So I think that Free Sea initiative, it was more strategic communication, but not, unfortunately, action and commitment. And that's what is missing in this project from my perspective.
Very interesting. What is the way out? I mean, Nick, how would you change and transform? What is your conclusion? Just to sort of...
It's difficult to judge what would or wouldn't work. There are a couple of things that we need to bear in mind here. Obviously, we're recording this on the 19th of January, 2021. But tomorrow, the Trump administration will end one way or another. And we don't know in much detail to what extent Biden is going to completely reimagine things. It might be that the Biden administration already intends to work more closely with Poland, but he hasn't said anything that suggests that strongly or otherwise. The most important thing I would say in terms of getting the importance of Poland increased as just sort of a generic way of doing so among these great powers is that you need to be able to demonstrate why Poland is able to contribute across multiple policy arenas that they're interested in. And I think that would start with being a proper hub of what is going on in the Intermarium region. Because right now, if somebody in Washington, D.C. wants to find out what is the center point of how Eastern Europe and Central Europe are being developed, they call two places, Brussels and Berlin. That's where the money is coming from. And they know that the EU investment is it's always going to be more than whatever the United States is willing to put into there for obvious reasons. It's a part of the European Union. But that means that Warsaw is just one particularly shiny bulb in the back. And because Warsaw is pro-United States, they're very happy about it. They're willing to commit military resources to Poland's protection. Now, I don't think that's going to be a major problem. Even if Biden ends up being very anti-Poland, I don't think he's going to withdraw very much of the military commitment. But it does mean that the importance of finding out what Warsaw is interested in is just permanently limited until Warsaw becomes the indispensable link between, for example, Germany and Ukraine, or between the entire front of Russian investment and criminal activities going on in Eastern Europe and what's going on and how that interacts with the EU, i.e. making Warsaw sort of a center of excellence for fighting Russian investments, for example, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Maybe it isn't realistic to put that in Warsaw, but it's an option. We saw that Warsaw tried to do this by sticking its nose into the Middle East Peace Initiative, and it had some effect. Mike Pompeo was personally involved in that on a number of occasions. But we also saw that that did not bring the Middle East experts from Washington to Warsaw independently to find out what Warsaw was doing. Because at the end of the day, Washington did not think that Warsaw's opinion about Jordan or Qatar is particularly important. They just were happy to have a partner to make it multilateral, because that's a buzzword that most countries are avid to keep using. So the easy way I would say here is you need to make Warsaw the center of excellence or center of power, possibly, for controlling issues that the United States thinks are inextricably linked to Poland. I think that starts with the Intermarian region.
Fair enough, Nick. Thank you very much.
If I might add something to what Nick mentioned, if I may, Jacek. You are on air more regular here than I am, so I'm using my chance to add something. I've read recently a commentary about some interviews or some remarks of American. I think it was one Assistant Secretary of Defense that was describing how Russia is managing its resources in case of from the military and political perspective. And it was very positive towards Russia. It was surprising to many that the Assistant Secretary of Defense of US was so complimenting its adversary from Russia. But that what was interesting, and I would say that would maybe take a lesson from it. That this gentleman mentioned that Russia, despite of very poor resources, is playing very good hand with those poor resources. And I think this is a lesson for us, for Poland, because I would say that we have quite good resources, both from geopolitical perspective, geography, logistics, transit, gravity for our neighbors, potential role in the EU, and a number of arguments which should build our trading arguments with all the partners, both inside of the European Union and outside, like in the United States and others. And I'm concerned that we are not capable of underlying our attributes, which are positioning us really as a regional, but a significant player that could have its role. And we could trade this role for a strong and really partnership alliances, not alliances being a sphere of influence. Well, even if it's our great friend from the United States, but I think we can do more, and we deserve more as well. So just remark.
Yeah, and that was a good conclusion, I think, with which we will conclude. It has been around 1 hour. Our guest at Strategy and Future was Nicholas Myers, the author of the presentation. Thank you, Nick. And Zbigniew Pisarski, head of Pulaski Foundation based in Warsaw. And
thank you very much.
And looking forward to having more episodes with you, gentlemen. And thank you, our listeners, for staying with us. And stay tuned to Strategy and Future.